Welcome once again this morning to our morning devotional. The God we serve is a compassionate God. Jesus was full of compassion, and Christ wants you and I to grow in compassion. That's what we looked at yesterday, the story of the Samaritan. Today we want to look at a story in the Bible of four friends that brought their paralyzed friend to Jesus. And I suppose these friends would have seen the suffering, the heartache this young man was going through being paralyzed. And I began to think about this because I really do think the solution for our world many a times is not just giving them bread. It's not just financial help that our world needs. When you look at our world, the injustice that's going on, when you look at a world and you see the poverty that's going on, you know what people really need is Jesus. And I think the ultimate act of compassion is pointing people to Jesus. And that's what these four friends did. They took their friend to Jesus. They took their friend to Jesus. Let's read it. Mark chapter 2, verse 1. Jesus returned to Capernaum several days later. The news spread quickly that he was back home. Soon the house where he was staying was so packed with visitors that there was no more room even outside the door. While he was preaching God's word to them, four men arrived carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd. So they dug a hole through the roof above his head. Then they lowered the man on his mat right down in front of Jesus. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralyzed man, "My child, your sins are forgiven." But some of the teachers of the religious law who were sitting there thought to themselves, "What is he saying? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins." Jesus knew immediately what they were thinking, so he asked them, "Why do you question this in your hearts? Is it easier to say, paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven,' or stand up, pick up your mat and walk? So I will prove to you that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Then Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, "Stand up, pick up your mat and go home." And the man jumped up, grabbed his mat, and walked out through the stunned onlookers. They were amazed and praised God, exclaiming, "We have never seen anything like this before." So here's this amazing story. The reality of this is that these four men, they have a friend. They know someone who's been paralyzed. We can tell that this paralyzed man wasn't always paralyzed, but something happened so that he could become paralyzed. And so I love to call these people his four friends, because for them to carry him on a mat and to take him to this house and then face an obstacle of a full house, and they thought to themselves, "We need to get our suffering friend right where Jesus is at." The full house wasn't an obstacle. They climbed on top, they opened up the roof, they inconvenienced to the owner of the house. People must have been jeering them, saying, "Hey, what are you doing? What are we doing?" But they were so dedicated, so wanting to see their friend made whole, so wanting to see their friend find relief, that they were willing to go through obstacles to do that. They lower their friend down. Jesus sees their friend. And it's interesting that Jesus says, because of their faith, he healed the man. Not because of the man's faith, but because of their faith. And I want to add this to the story, that it was because of their compassion. They saw their friend hurting, and they were willing to take a risk and bring their friend before Jesus. The greatest act that we can do of compassion is to point the people we know who are suffering and in pain or facing injustice, is to point them to Jesus. Maybe this weekend, I want to challenge you to point some people to Jesus, to find some people in your family, to find some people in your community, some people you know who are hurting, and point them to Jesus. Because that's what compassion is. The greatest act of compassion you and I can ever do is to point a broken person to Jesus. Have a fantastic week.